Hello and welcome to the Lyle Shelton Show. It's great to have your company. Most Australians like me who grew up in the 1970s and 80s took it for granted that Australia was a tolerant nation where people were free to say what they believed about anything. People might not agree with you, but they would fight to the death for your right to say what you thought. Sadly, those days are gone thanks to an intolerant political movement which has taken over our media and our politics. I want to talk about this and much more on today's episode of The Lyle Shelton Show. Don't touch that dial. Now, many of you know that legal action has been taken against me by two Brisbane drag queens. 2 weeks ago, I was forced to go to conciliation at the Queensland Human Rights Commission. The drag queens have accused me of breaching the Anti-Discrimination Act by allegedly vilifying them and discriminating against them. The State Government's Human Rights Commission agreed with them and called me in. I had no choice but to go. It's the law. My crime was to write a blog about an episode that occurred in January of this year when some brave young people from the LNP protested about drag queens reading to children at a Brisbane City Council library. Here's some footage of their leader, Wilson Gavin, and his compatriots from the University of Queensland Liberal National Club, firmly but politely confronting one of the drag queens. Take a look.
Drag queens are not for kids. Drag queens are not for kids. Drag queens are not for kids. Very much. Drag queens are not for kids. 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 Drag queens are not for kids.
You do not have permission to film me.
GPS has been pulled.
Are you just going to hold the camera on my face like that indefinitely?
Drag queens are not for kids. 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 Drag queens are not for kids.
Now, I think these young people were incredibly brave. There was no yelling or screaming, as fake news media later reported. If leaders were doing their jobs in protecting children, this protest would have been unnecessary. Sadly, leaders are asleep at the wheel and lacking the moral fibre and courage to stand up to the LGBTIQA+ political movement, which, since the same-sex marriage plebiscite, is out of control. After this footage emerged on social media, there was a vicious pile-on online on Wilson and his friends by gay and left-wing activists. Wilson, a gay man, took himself to the Chelmer railway station in Brisbane's inner west early the next morning and threw himself in front of an oncoming train. I attended his funeral the next week at Clifton on the Darling Downs. It was unspeakably sad. Wilson was persecuted for doing the right thing. Drag queens represent a hypersexualised genre of the LGBTIQA+ adult entertainment and gender-fluid queer theory. Yes, that's a thing, and it animates the so-called Safe Schools program, which in Queensland lives on, teaching children that their gender is fluid under the banner of a rebadge program called Respectful Relationships. It's compulsory in Queensland state schools. Now, the LGBTIQA+ political movement wants preschool children inducted into these same concepts and is pushing for drag queen story time at public libraries around the nation. The Brisbane City Council has sadly capitulated to this and doubled down on it despite a petition from 7,000 mainstream residents calling for drag queen story time to be abolished. Now, I did some research on the two drag queens who were reading to children last January and wrote about them on my blog. This is available. You can go back and have a look at it at lyleshelton.com.au. These drag queens advocate for the porn industry and for teaching children that their gender is fluid, something that has resulted in an epidemic of confused children turning up at gender clinics unsure of whether they are a boy or a girl. Many are being prescribed harmful puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and some adolescent girls have had their breasts surgically removed so they can present as boys. Never did the drag queens seek to debate what I had to say in my blog. Why debate when you can litigate? Now, my friend Corey Bernardi read my blog and phoned me to tell me he was going to raise my case on Sky News. Here he is.
Like a lot of normal people, I think the idea of drag queens with highly sexualised pseudonyms and personas reading stories to children is rather strange. The fact that they are also sanctioned by the state to teach children to ignore biological reality and rather choose their own gender adventure, I think is dangerous. Some would actually say it's child abuse. That's why drag queen storytime in Queensland has attracted a modicum of opposition and some polite protests. But the abuse from some in response to these protests led one young gay man who actually opposed drag queen storytime to tragically take his own life. And this week, I learned of even more pushback. One patriotic Australian and a friend of mine, Lyle Shelton, dared write about the history of storytime participants and detail why he didn't think they were appropriate role models. Now, I'll give you a hint. It might have something to do with one of them actually winning an award from the porno industry. Anyway, the precious petals have now dragged Lyle Shelton to the Human Rights Commission, where he's forced to turn up and respond to these allegations. If he doesn't, he could go to jail. Now imagine that. Maybe, just maybe, going to jail for saying that something rather creepy is, well, rather creepy. Is there no freedom of speech, thought or expression anymore? But if that's not bad enough, the drag queens have no legal expenses of their own. The state is picking up their legal tab, while the real victim here, Lyle Shelton, has to crowdfund for his legal defence. Now, this is just another recent example of where the process is part of the punishment when you dare to stand against the regressive radicals. And this abusive process has been embraced by those that are seeking to overturn normality and change society to fit their own image. I say enough is enough. Parliament needs to put a stop to this nonsense.
Emma Hazar, a fellow panellist with Corey on Sky, dismissed the whole issue. She's a former Labor member of the Federal Parliament. Here's what she had to say about me being dragged before the Human Rights Commission.
So in this case, it's the drag queens who have taken Lyle Shelton, who isn't unfamiliar or in unfamiliar territory about shooting his mouth off, potentially inappropriately.
No,
in
about
this
having
case.
an opinion, a valid opinion. He's having a valid opinion, Emma, not shooting his mouth off.
You can have a valid opinion, but you can still do so in a way that's offensive to other people. And just because someone has an opinion, it doesn't give them freedom of consequence of having such an opinion. Everybody has an opinion, and how you choose to share that opinion is obviously, governed by yourself, and it's a self-regulatory practice of knowing the difference between something that's offensive and is going to offend a segment or a group, in this case a minority of our society. If we want to all live harmoniously and we all want a freedom of expression, we've all got a freedom to be responsible, and that's where Lyle's come unstuck.
Well, I think Emma, you make a very good point that you are free to have an opinion, and nothing that Lyle Shelton wrote would be, I think, in any reasonable reading of it, reasons for him to be taken to the Human Rights Tribunal, and yet he has to be victimised by this.
Now, having a former Labor MP simply push aside the arguments that have been raised with the slur that Lyle Shelton shoots his mouth off, it's chilling. I'm caught up in a legal process for, as Corey rightly said, expressing a valid opinion. Yet Labor identities see this legal architecture as scaffold on which to hang those with whom they disagree. There's no debate when all you have to do is litigate. Who would have ever thought Australia would come to this? But this is where the LGBTIQA+ political agenda has taken our nation. As Corey said, it is now time that politicians moved to reform these laws. I think if a majority of Australians knew what was going on, they would demand reform. State and federal anti-discrimination laws need an overhaul so people like me can't be taken to commissions or tribunals simply because someone thinks they're offended. Also, I think it's time that these so-called human rights commissions at state and federal level were abolished. People like me who grew up here never thought we would have to fight for free speech. People who fled other countries to migrate here did so because they thought this was a free country. Sadly, thanks to political correctness and identity politics, the law has now been weaponised against free speech. My case is but one of many recent cases which should be a wake-up call for mainstream Australians. If Australia is to remain free, we need our politicians to have the courage to act. Well, welcome back to the Lyle Shelton Show. I want to just talk about my book. I wrote my book, I kid you not, Notes from 20 Years in the Trenches of the Culture Wars, because I wanted people to know what's been going on behind the scenes in our politics. The stories that I tell are all true, yet they have been untold until now. The media won't tell them because it doesn't suit the narrative. It doesn't suit their narrative to acknowledge that harm has come from so-called progressive politics. I've been blown away by the feedback that I've had from many of you in the couple of months since the book was released. People tell me it has opened their eyes, it has made them angry with politicians, and it has urged them to get more involved. If you haven't read my book, can I encourage you to get a copy at lyleshelton.com.au. If you have read it, please think about who you can encourage to read it. It might be a leader or a pastor. Things have to change. We can't keep going the way we are. It is my hope that this book will help progress the conversations that we need to have in this nation about difficult issues. Well, thanks again for tuning in this week. Don't forget to check out the brilliant range of commentary available right here at The Good Source, Good Source News. And I'll see you again next week for another episode of The Lyle Shelton Show. Bye for now.
The Lyle Shelton Show is a production of The Good Source, hosted by Lyle Shelton. To watch, listen to, or read more content without the SJW PC fact filter, visit goodsource.news. Good, SAUCE.news. Become a Good Source supporter for exclusive access to live and unedited interview recordings, including the conversations before and after the show.